we're back with another episode of Bloody Up Radar. I am Russian Sam, and I am joined by my co-host Sam B.
Hello there.
As well as our buddy Kevin.
Hi, everyone.
Who we're very happy to have back because his previous episode with us about the history of Zionism as an ideology was such a hit. But today, Kevin is going to speak with us about the more practical aspects of this moment. Whereas last time we focused more on the ideology of the Zionist movement, now we're getting to the hard stuff. Now we're getting to, the actually existing development of a state on the territory of Mandatory Palestine. And of course, this also fits very well into our Interwar series because many of the themes are very relevant to the history of colonialism in the interwar period.
Yes, we were going to just be covering the mandatory period in the interwar period, obviously. We won't be going to and past 1948, but there is a lot to talk about in this period in Mandatory Palestine. The new yeshuv, by which I mean the settler Jewish community established after Zionism became a thing in Palestine, was kind of like a petri dish for breeding some of the most insane, weird, esoteric political thought you could imagine. So you get a lot of fun characters here, a lot of really interesting people. But before we get there, we're going to have to start with some questions of terminology.
In Zionist historiography, traditionally, they focused really heavily on the question of aliyah. For those of you guys who don't know, aliyah, it literally means ascent, and that's also the term for immigrating to the land of Israel, Palestine. So basically, in the Zionist historiography, everything is centered around these aliyot. So you have the first aliyah, second aliyah, and it keeps going until the sixth or the seventh, I believe. And so the focus there is that these different waves have different conditions and different factors. In the Zionist historiography, the common thread is that the point is to make Jewish migration to Palestine seem exceptional. And in the last decade, there's been some really great work that challenges this assumption. Particularly, there was one book called Unpromising Land by an Israeli historian named Gur Al-Roi, who questions this framing very heavily. In this book, he examines the migration to Palestine from Eastern Europe from the period of 1904 to 1914, which is traditionally considered to be the period of the second Aliyah, which is considered to have laid the ideological foundation of the State of Israel as it would come to existence in 1948. So Al-Roi, he examines how this migration happened in relation to other destinations, especially the United States. So his point here basically is that as opposed to the idea that these immigrants were all like, these chalutzim, these pioneers who were super committed Zionists who just got right off the boat and went to live in kibbutzes. Al-Roi actually finds that the vast majority of these people were motivated by the same economic forces that spurred immigration to the Americas, and that most of these people were not ideological at all. He finds that Jewish immigrants to Palestine during this period were, on average, less educated and less likely to have a profession than the people who were going to the U.S. So just for comparison's sake, 65% of immigrants who came to Palestine had no profession compared to 43% of those going to the United States. And they were, on average, much poorer than the immigrants to America. In addition, only 16% of the people who came in this supposedly most ideological wave of the Zionist migration to Palestine, only 16% of those people wanted to settle in Zionist agricultural colonies, as opposed to a city. 3 out of 4 people wanted to live in either Jerusalem, Jaffa, or Hebron, but the remainder wanted to live in other cities.
16% only wanted to go to kibbutzim, which is just tiny.
Yeah, that's amazing. And in fact, we do know that after the creation of the State of Israel, the population of the kibbutzim never exceeded about 4%, according to most statistics about this issue, which is amazing because if you look at the material about history written by Zionism itself, you would think that the kibbutz was such a monumental institution. In fact, it is so much blown up in Zionist historiography, it is unbelievable.
Absolutely. This was never like the majority of the settler Jewish community there. Not even close.
Yeah, and there are 2 clear reasons for that. One was the fact that kibbutzim had, the elite of cultural, political, and social institutions. That is on one hand, which also explains why in the 70s they were, sort of demonized as millionaires with kibbutzim, and the elite of the country that was so benefited with government policy. And on the second hand, the fact that it's blown up is due to the fact that this presented the most human, progressive, and sexy face of Zionism to all the progressives in the Western world and the Soviet bloc.
Yeah, it's like very second international, early 20th century kind of, and it did produce, as you said, it produced importantly a lot of members of the elite, both economically and also politically. Like Golda Meir is an obvious example, was a kibbutznik.
Yeah, Moshe Dayan, David Ben-Gurion.
And I mean, I can see why. It's a very compelling story. I mean, granted, it's bullshit, but this idea that, like, oh, we came to Palestine with nothing except for the love of Zion in our hearts, and then we made the desert bloom through our own sheer force of will because this is our destiny, and yada, yada, yada.
Side note, that is exactly the same thing that Mormons believe about Utah.
Let me read a section from Al-Roi's book that I found particularly enlightening. Articles in the newspapers and reports on immigration to Palestine all described immigrants who came to the country with concern and depicted them in dark colors. Quote, "The immigration does not stop. On the contrary, it is increasing," we read in the newspaper Hazman. "Part of those who come here remain in the country, part return to Russia, and the rest go on from here to America, Canada, and Egypt. It is necessary to say, once again, that poor people, fathers of families without any skills, should not come here, as they will not find the means to live." 4 months later, the newspaper described the immigrants as follows. "There has been a great increase in poverty among the immigrants. There are eye diseases among the children, and they have no one to support them or help them." The newspaper informs us not only that the poor immigrants came to Palestine, but that among them there were immigrants with eye disease who would most likely not have passed through medical checks at Ellis Island. It seems that rather than being a, quote, land of heart's desire, Palestine was a fallback option for Jews who wanted to emigrate from Western Europe but were unable to reach the United States. It would seem that in those years, Palestine became a place of immigration rather than a site of aspiration. It was not only idealistic pioneers that came to the country, but also the poor and wretched among the Jews of Eastern Europe, who hoped there would be someone to receive them in Palestine.
Makes a lot of sense, and is very contrary to what Zionists have been spending the past 80 years saying.
Yeah, well, every nationalist movement has its own ideologies, but in the historiography, you see a bifurcation between the yeshuvs. So you have the old yeshuv and the new yeshuv. The word yeshuv literally means settlement or community, and really, when people talk about the old yeshuv, what they mean is the Jewish community that was already in Palestine before 1880s, and the new yeshuv are those who came afterwards. It paints a very stark narrative that has very hard barriers. So, in other words, this assumption that the old yeshuv people are all these traditionalist religious people who came to Palestine either to die or to study in yeshiva, versus the new yeshuv, which was very modern and secular, which came to Palestine to, create a nation state. I feel personally that this hard boundary really hides differences within these groups. So going back to Al-Roi, he found that during the period of the Second Aliyah, 22% of Jewish immigrants to Palestine were over 50, as opposed to only 6% of those who went to America. And for Jews who went to Palestine by way of Odessa, 72% reported that they were going to Palestine to settle, and as well as 13% who said that they were going there to die. The remainder gave other options, but those were the two big ones. And I guess all of that is to say that the migration during this period of Second Aliyah, in addition to people who were immigrating for economic opportunities and a small minority of ideological Zionists, also included people who are much more typical of the old yeshuv so-called archetype.
Yeah, I would say it's not just a very tricky distinction. Also, we have to keep in mind that there are some characters there that kind of draw bridges between them. For example, religious Zionists, or people who are Orthodox but kind of supported Zionism, were somewhere in between this kind of useful, looking back, but not real authentic distinction. And the fact that the new yeshuv presents itself as something that is economically self-dependent, as opposed to the old yeshuv, which depended on foreign donations, where nobody worked, they all worked in yeshivas, really hides the fact that for many decades, the first Zionist settlements were completely dependent on philanthropical donations from rich Jews in Europe. They were far from self-reliant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, hell, that went on for quite a while longer. I don't think they would have been able to win in 48 without weapons shipments from Europe.
They had their tools provided by rich Jews from Europe, and the produce was bought by rich Jews from Europe, which was the only way that somebody would buy their produce, because it was so much cheaper to buy from Arab-produced products from the land. So it really made no sense. There was no economic point to the Zionist settlements for the first several decades.
Yeah, the point was just rather to create the networks that would allow them to build something in this land rather than making these investments for the sake of making a profit. So as we mentioned in our previous episode about Zionism with Kevin, in addition to the local Jewish population of Palestine, you had these Jews who continued to migrate to the land in small numbers through the centuries. For example, elderly people coming to Palestine to die, basically, and in the meantime subsisting on donations. That was a very common occurrence throughout the years. And so in addition to these local Arabic-speaking Jews who were, who had been there pretty much continuously for thousands of years, they were called the Mustarabim, which, fun fact, that word means something very different now. Right now, that word is used to denote the units of the Israeli secret services that dress up as Palestinians and try to provoke violence.
The Fawra type, you might have seen them.
Oh, Jesus.
So in addition to the Arabic-speaking Jews, you also had Ladino speakers, you had Yiddish speakers, you had Greek speakers. Basically, this was a place where people went to from all over the world. And these communities, they seem to have numbered around 25,000 people around 1880, which was before the first Aliyah is supposed to have begun. And they were mostly centered around the so-called four holy cities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Tzfat. Jerusalem was the largest of these communities and was home to approximately 15,000 Jews. As I mentioned previously, these were very pious people. These are, Orthodox Jews who came to the land to study and die, and who were totally dependent on donations from the diaspora. I think that was called Halakha. Jews from all over the world would collect money from their congregations and send it over to Palestine to support these people. They didn't have much of a productive base, although I think that there were some Jewish peasants still. So yeah, in Zionist historiography, you have this idea that these people are, totally incompatible with Zionism, and that there were tensions, and all of this is true, but again, it's not the full picture. And then, in contrast to the old Yishuv, you had the new Yishuv, who were, these muscle Jews.
The Hebrew-speaking farmer with a gun.
So the new Yishuv, there was steady migration, although up until this point, there was more out-migration than people coming in. But nevertheless, the Jewish community in Palestine steadily grew. On the eve of World War I, there were something between 65 and 85,000 Jews living in Palestine. And this is when many of the trends that we would later come to see embodied in the mandate first began to appear. So, for example, the phenomenon of absentee landlords selling lands to Zionist settlers, this was when this phenomenon really began. It was still very localized, and although it was being denounced in Palestinian newspapers, it still, nevertheless, wasn't very much a mass movement like it would become in the mandate period. Rather, this was something that intellectuals concerned themselves with for the most part, because there weren't enough of these settlers yet to cause problems for most of the residents of Palestine.
So one interesting aspect of life in the Yishuv is the whole issue of what they did with language. In the beginning, Zionism didn't really have a general policy about what the language would be in a future Jewish homeland or a Jewish state. In fact, Herzl famously said a Jewish state would probably be officially a German-speaking country, since that was the language of cultured Jews at the time. And he even made fun of people who were proposed reviving the Hebrew language, saying, can you imagine buying a train ticket in Hebrew? And the joke was pretty obvious, because at the time there was no way of saying either train or a ticket. So there was really no way of buying a train ticket.
Yeah, he was right about that.
I mean, he was right. He just couldn't imagine there would be such a concerted effort within the Yishuv to revive the Hebrew language.
And that it would work. It is an insane bet.
It not only would work, but also very early on in the British Mandate period, Hebrew would actually be recognized as one of the two official languages of the population of the Yishuv, the other one obviously being Arabic, which was the majority language.
Yeah, if you look at the currency from that era, it has Hebrew and Arabic and English on it.
Exactly. And so do all official documents are in all three languages. Now, it should be said that reviving the Hebrew language was not a mission invented by Zionism. It was something that existed long before. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, this idea of breaking away from the walls of the ghetto and reinventing Jewish identity based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, political emancipation, and more, gave way to a lot of people from the intellectual world to try to rethink what Jewish identity was like, what Hebrew was, what it meant to be Jewish. And part of the response from the Haskalah was also, let's try to make modern secular literature in the Hebrew language, understanding Hebrew not just as the holy tongue, but also as the national language of the Jewish people. So there was a modern Hebrew that wasn't Zionist in the beginning. It's just that Zionism really took on this effort and gave it a very centralized institutional support. They very quickly started founding Hebrew schools in Palestine, and they started penalizing the use of other language. There were actually armed gangs on the street trying to punish people who spoke different languages.
Yeah, but that was more during the Mandate period, I believe, the Biryonim.
Yes, exactly. This is something that it turns into official issue policy during the Mandate. But even in the last days of the Ottomans, the first institutions of higher learning that were supported by European Jews, they ran into heavy resistance, something called the language wars in the year 1913, when they tried to make what is now the Technion teach in German. The population of the Yishuv that identified with Zionism, again, this sort of cultural, political elite of the time, they said no, they have to speak Hebrew, and boycotted the institution until they reversed their policy.
Yes, and that was really the big moment of the language wars, but really the foundation had been being laid for this for well over a decade at this point. There's been a lot of attention recently drawn to Hebrew-speaking primary school teachers in the Ottoman period because, for the most part, these were basically like young women who just got off the boat and basically their only qualification was that they kind of knew how to speak Hebrew, and so these women would take it upon themselves to become teachers in Jewish daycares and primary schools, so that classrooms would be conducted in the Hebrew language.
Yeah, eventually you get a generation of native Hebrew speakers, which is, we can talk about the revival during the Haskalah, and that's very important and foundational to this, but you didn't have any native speakers of the language then. You get native speakers in Palestine.
Yeah, whereas a couple of decades ago, a Ben Yehuda's son had to speak Hebrew with his dog because he had no one else to speak Hebrew with. Now the kids, they were talking to each other in Hebrew. Didn't
Ben Yehuda's son want to Romanize Hebrew?
Yes, he tried. He continued with much of his father's work and finished the publication of the first modern Hebrew dictionary that was started by his father, but he also had some crazy ideas, which would have made Hebrew quite easier to learn, like using Roman letters, adapted Roman letters, much like the Turks had done not long before with Turkish.
There are some comparisons to make between the language policies of the new Yishuv and the language policies of the Turkish Republic in terms of you can only speak the national language.
But I'd say the difference was that whereas in Turkey, this was something that applied universally to all people living in Turkey, at this stage, there was really no need for the Yishuv to try to make Palestinian Arabs speak Hebrew.
Was it not? They're not a need, or was that explicitly, did that just not align with their goals?
There's a clear logic of exclusion. And if you want to make that exclusion a reality, then I would believe that linguistic exclusion is a fundamental tool. To separate the two communities, you're separating them economically by Hebrew policy, the Hebrew labor policy. It makes sense to also make the two populations distinct and quite separate from each other in terms of not really being able to communicate fluently with one another.
This also goes to the schooling, and this ensures that Jews will be in school with other Jews speaking Hebrew.
And also try to eliminate the very marginal, but still, I guess, worthwhile remembering efforts at some kind of organized, like, sort of cooperation policy, like we saw briefly in union organizing, for example, during the Mandate era.
Yeah, Zachary Lockman has a great book about Jewish and Arab workers in the railway, which was one of the only integrated workplaces. And there are some great anecdotes in there, like about Palestinian workers learning to speak Yiddish.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking about. I mean, these very small examples of class-based solidarity were completely buried when nationalism became the ruling dynamics in all sectors of the population.
So ultimately, like these socialist Zionists, they felt that they would have to make a choice between the nationalism and the Zionism, and the overwhelming majority of them decided that they are indeed standing on the nationalist side. At this point, Palestine was still a part of the Ottoman Empire. So naturally, some of the people who came there, they would want to, become Ottoman subjects, as in to renounce their subjecthood to the Russian Empire, for example, and to become Ottomans instead.
Okay, so in the beginning, there wasn't a full, comprehensive, unified policy as to what Zionists would have to do and what was their ultimate goal, right? So some people believed that a Jewish homeland within the Ottoman Empire was possible, and that it just required to strengthen the relationship between Zionism and the Ottoman ruling class. Based on that assumption, which of course was very different to what actually happened, which was the British taking control and Zionism eventually lobbying the British, sometimes more, sometimes less successfully, into creating a Jewish state, there was a significant element within the Yishuv that thought about the strategy of turning into Ottoman subjects. Now, this turned out to be really useful since those who took on Ottoman citizenship were actually much less subject to restrictions and to repressive policies in comparison to the mainly Russian subjects that inhabited the Yishuv. Just keep in mind that when World War I broke out, Russians who lived in the Ottoman Empire were, declared enemy citizens. And a lot of them got deported. A lot of them were jailed and suspected of espionage, which was partly true. There was a small sector of people in the Yishuv actually doing works of espionage.
Wait, for the imperial...
For the British, then they were tortured and killed very savagely. But people like Ben Gurion, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was later president of Israel, and of course Ben Gurion, famously the first prime minister of Israel, they thought, let's become Ottomans. So let's maintain some of our Jewish identity, speak Hebrew among one another, but also let's wear a fez, let's learn Turkish, let's go to their universities and try to blend in, particularly with the Ottoman ruling class.
Yeah, I always found it very interesting and telling that he learned Turkish and not Arabic.
Yes, exactly. That is very interesting because they were obviously more interested in lobbying than actually integrated with the majority native population.
Exactly. If he wanted to speak to the native population, he would have learned Arabic. Instead, he went to Istanbul and learned Turkish.
But this is also super interesting because the Zionist organization was also based in Germany, but had significant branches all over Europe. So when World War I broke out, you had, Zionists supporting both sides and branches of the Zionist organization, with a majority supporting either side. And in the end, they just kind of played one another. The Balfour Declaration, which we're going to talk about soon, was actually partly achieved by convincing the British that a similar German declaration was bound to come up, and the British, it was in the British interest to sort of be the first one to get there, because the Zionists were a significant force, and they would continue to be a growing force within Palestine and within Europe. So it was, the British might as well just be their main sponsor.
I'm right. So again, you had a small faction of the Zionist settlers who took a decidedly Ottomanist orientation, which is a very interesting phenomenon. But speaking of the Ottoman Empire, war happens. And the Ottoman Empire, they were for a while unsure as to which side they were going to support. There was a lot of deliberation in the first few months of the war. As far as I understand it, Enver Pasha, who was one of the members of the Committee of Union and Progress and one of the heads of the so-called triumvirate. He was the only one who was unambiguously pro-German. The other two were either for neutrality or for entry into the war on the Ally side.
Oh, really? They were set, which is very interesting because they'd be on the same side as Russia then, which had spent the past several generations trying to take Constantinople.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that ultimately dissuaded them from joining the Allies. But yeah, let's talk about Germany for a moment. The Germans had been cultivating much more positive relations with the Ottomans than either the French or the British of this period. Basically, the French, British, and the Russians had all been encroaching on Ottoman territory for decades and trying to carve pieces off. So the French, for example, they were able to get autonomy on Mount Lebanon to allegedly to protect the Christian subjects of the area who were the subjects of some very violent sectarian violence. And the British, who of course took over Egypt, which was had an on-again, off-again relationship with the Ottoman Empire. The Russians, they were just lusting for Constantinople and the Dardanelles because they wanted to have full control over their entry into the Mediterranean. In addition to this, traditionally, the great powers of Europe had maintained a policy of Ottoman territorial integrity. At that point, the Ottoman Empire was considered to be the so-called sick man of Europe. So basically, there was this idea that they were in terminal decline.
Which is not really true, to be clear. There's been a lot of scholarship about this, and it's not really true that the Ottomans were just doomed to fail completely. But that was a perception and still is.
Yeah, it's an absolute ideological characterization, which, by the way, just as Russian Sam is coming from the Russian Empire. But it was also very convenient to say that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, since it gave a sort of even humanitarian justification for eating away the different territories that Europe was taking away.
We're liberating the Greeks, we're liberating the Bulgarians, we're liberating the Maronites of Mount Lebanon.
Yeah, the Ottomans are completely screwed. Let's just save the Christians from this dying empire before they get eaten away and die with it.
Yeah, so again, for decades, the policy had been to kind of maintain territorial integrity because they felt that if shit really hit the fan and everyone was trying to conquer the territories of the Ottoman Empire, then there would be a great power war within Europe. And after the Napoleonic saga, nobody wanted a repeat of that. But over time, that fear really lost its grip on reality. And because of that, they started losing territory at a massively expedited rate. So in 1912, they lost Libya. And then in 1913, you had the first Balkan Wars.
You're forgetting the loss of Greece and Bulgaria. But most importantly, really, I would argue one of the big ones was Algeria in the 19th century by the French.
Yeah, so essentially what had happened was that during the Italo-Ottoman War, the Libya War, France and Britain, which had traditionally tried to, minimize Ottoman territorial losses when it suited them, at least, they sort of stayed out of this one, which created a lot of bad blood. And then, again, when the Balkan War happened, again, there wasn't much movement to keep the Ottomans from losing their European holdings. And so because of this, again, this was happening in 1912 and 1913. So when the war breaks out, this was all very fresh. And so in July 1914, when the war finally breaks out, at first, Jamal and Talat Pasha, who are the other two members of the triumvirate, attempted to secure alliances with France and Britain, respectively, but to no avail. And to make the situation even worse, when the war began, when Britain entered the war, they ordered the requisition of two dreadnought battleships, which had just been completed and which had been commissioned by the Ottoman Navy. And boy, what a misguided move, because on August 2nd and 2nd, largely as a result of the fallout from this confiscation, a secret treaty was signed between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, which was worded very vaguely in such a way that the Ottomans technically didn't need to declare war. But nevertheless, relations just continued to get closer and closer. And about a week after this treaty was signed, the Ottomans opened the Black Sea to German military ships, which had formerly been bought by the Ottomans, which was largely a fiction. But anyway, this was a big no-no. They were not supposed to be able to do this. And consequently, the admiral of these two ships, who was Wilhelm Souchon, fun fact, his nephew killed Rosa Luxemburg.
Oh, wow. Amazing fact.
Yes, it is. Souchon, he became the commander-in-chief of the Ottoman Navy at this point. So basically, he came with the ships. And you have this period of escalation over the coming months. But nevertheless, many people within the Ottoman government itself, they didn't actually want to go to war. So Enver Pasha, he had to engineer a way to get the Ottomans into the war. And he decided that he would do this by telling Souchon to stage the Black Sea raids, which was when the Ottoman fleet shelled a bunch of Russian ports, basically. And it worked. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 1st, and now the Ottomans were officially at war on the side of the Central Powers. So Jamal Pasha, he was one of the heads of the triumvirate, and he was the military governor of Syria, basically the entirety of the Levant from 1915. And let me tell you, he was not a good leader. He's remembered very poorly. To give you guys an idea of how his reputation is going, in Arabic, his nickname is Al-Jazar. So
the butcher?
Yeah, the butcher, exactly. So Jamal Pasha, he was one of the heads of the triumvirate, which had come to power basically on the back of the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, when the Sultan was forced to restore the constitution by this group of people who are called the Young Turks. This wasn't really a coherent entity at this point, per se. It was a very eclectic mix of people. You had the point of commonality was that they were all modernizers to some degree or another, but they had very different ideas of how modernization was to occur. So after this constitutional restoration, there are many different parties formed, active for a couple of years in the Ottoman Parliament, and the Committee of Union and Progress became the face of a Turkish nationalist ideology, which had supplanted the previous civic nationalism called Ottomanism, which had reigned up until this point. And in 1913, as a result of a bunch of different factors we don't have time to get into now, the CUP was able to do a coup against the democratic government writ large and became a one-party state, which was increasingly hostile to minorities.
Essentially, the Ottoman Empire had been chipped away by these nationalist revolts, and the feeling was, well, clearly they're not loyal to us. And the state, in addition to that, also just got more and more Turkic and Muslim, as the Ottoman heartland basically was reduced to just Anatolia and stuff south of that, after they lost more and more of the Balkans. Yeah,
so the CUP was, from the beginning, a very centralist party, i.e. they wanted to increase the power of the state vis-a-vis local notables who at that point would have been dominating politics in the Arabic-speaking parts of the empire. And so during wartime, they basically had an excuse to squash anyone who they felt stood in the way of that goal in a way that was much more explicit than had been done previously. And so, Jamal Pasha, as I said, not a great guy by any stretch of the imagination. His rule over the Levant was genuinely disastrous. The biggest problem was really famine.
The famine is still remembered especially in Lebanon today. It's one of the reasons Lebanon's borders look the way they do, because you have to have more than just Mount Lebanon, which does not have a ton of agricultural land. So they had to include all the areas of the Bekaa Valley and the south where you can actually grow food and prevent a famine.
Yeah, that's right. So when the Ottoman Empire joined the war, suddenly they found that their ports were being blockaded by the British, who had a far superior navy. And this really heavily damaged the economy of the Levant in general, but Mount Lebanon in particular, which was very export dependent. It was a cash crop economy. Something like 50% of its money came from silk export. So basically, these people were not growing their own food. They were dependent on food imported from other parts of the empire, mostly Syria. And so suddenly, like first of all, they lost their revenue stream. And second of all, there suddenly wasn't enough food to go around because food needed to be directed towards the needs of the military, which meant that there wasn't enough for both the civilians and the soldiers' needs. And it meant that the crop-bearing regions of Syria that had traditionally supplied Lebanon could no longer do so. The result was the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon, which would result in basically the death of 200,000 people on Mount Lebanon alone, as well as another 200,000 who would be forced to flee the area.
Yeah, it lost like half its population.
And some people think that this famine was deliberately engineered by Jamal Pasha because the inhabitants of Mount Lebanon had been under French influence for so long and were mostly non-Muslims. So the line of thinking here is that they were deprived on purpose so that the Ottoman Empire wouldn't have to deal with this problem of having all these pesky minorities in the area. Yes, and of course, this line of thinking goes very well with the other events that were happening in the empire, the genocides and massacres of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek populations of the empire.
Like it was so extensive that the area of Western Armenia was just renamed to Eastern Anatolia afterwards because the Armenians were just gone. They just killed them all, and the ones who weren't killed were exiled.
And in 1915, the famines started to spread further afield because there was an unprecedented onslaught of locusts, which really completely devastated crop yields. It was so bad that the Ottoman authorities were basically mandating that every single person bring a couple of kilograms of these locust eggs to be disposed of because it was just an unbelievable pressure on the empire. So according to the historian Zachary Foster, these famines had in aggregate a, quote, death toll as high as 500,000 by the end of 1918, out of a population estimated between 3.1 and 4.4 million. That amounts to a civilian death rate of 11 to 16%, some 10 to 15 times higher than most of the major European powers in the conflict. And yeah, depending on the type of crop, something between 60 and 100% of the produce for the summer harvest was destroyed by the locusts, and 10 to 15% of the winter harvest shared the same fate, which created this massive, absolutely massive food shortage, which became a region-wide problem. And of course, the situation with the Ottoman military requisitioning food to feed itself didn't help the situation. There were also profiteers. Many men were absent from the land because they had been drafted into the military or into forced labor battalions, which further pushed down yields. And there was also the element of, the fact that these people were consistently losing their crop, which meant that they were getting poorer and poorer because they had no capital coming in. So it was bad. And these kinds of conditions, they tend to breed a lot of resentment. But it should be noted that a lot of the response by the Ottoman authorities was motivated by paranoia rather than a concrete possibility of subversion by Arab nationalist elements, who were, first of all, a very small portion of the population at that point, and second of all, a majority of them had been pursuing the idea of Arab rights within an Ottoman framework. These were not separatists. This idea of a universal Arab nationalist support for independence is really an invention of later Arab nationalist historiography. But one of the events memorialized in this period is the May 6, 1916 execution of Arab nationalists in Damascus and Beirut. It was really one of the formative experiences of Arab nationalism, and it's why Jamal Pasha got his nickname, the Butcher.
What was his opinion on the Jews, given that this guy loves genocide so much and hates minorities?
Well, I would believe he correctly felt that Zionism was a threat to the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. The issue with Jamal Pasha is that if you look at what he said and what he did, is that he probably drew no distinction between the Jewish community of Palestine and Zionism itself, right?
No, I mean, he didn't really. He tended to believe that all members of a nation adhere to that nationalism. Every Armenian is an Armenian nationalist, etc.
Exactly, which, I mean, if Jews were normal people, I guess it makes sense, which means that they instantly become a threat to Ottoman integrity. And particularly if you look at this way that Turkish nationalism became sort of the central force in a very eclectic coalition, which was the Ottoman government, essentially the one common element that they had was suspicion and hostility towards minorities and their political aspirations. And in fact, you have at the time correspondence between the different elements of the Zionist organization saying, hey, you guys should really rethink the way you support the Ottomans and their allies, the Germans, seeing as our brethren in Palestine are really going through a very difficult time. Which, by the way, did not prevent Jamal Pasha from hiring some Jewish scientists and some people in the government. But in general, he was quite suspicious of the growing yeshuv. And in fact, during those years, the population of the yeshuv actually decreased because of political repression and the hardship of the war.
Yeah, the Jewish population of Palestine fell by as much as 30,000 people during the war.
The fear of famine must have been another reason to leave, right?
Yes, and forced conscription.
But then you get the British invasion of Palestine. What does Jamal Pasha do when that happens? And how is that thought of by the Zionists?
Yeah, so as the British were making ground and starting to enter the territory of Palestine, there was another seemingly anti-Jewish action taken by Jamal Pasha, which and I say seemingly because that's how the Zionist historiography framed it. And this is indeed the narrative that the Allies had gone with during this time because it makes the Ottomans look awful. So basically what had happened was he ordered that Jaffa be evacuated of all of its residents, including the Jews, as the Ottoman military didn't want to have to deal with the prospect of fighting in the city where the civilian population was sitting in place. And yeah, this is what they had done in Gaza in the beginning of March. They had ordered the evacuation of the city, and the only non-combatants allowed to remain were nationals of the Ottoman Empire's allies, basically. So the residents of Gaza, they were told to leave, and so they did. And later in that month, the residents of Jaffa and / Tel Aviv, which was starting to grow in this period, were given the evacuation order. And yes, that's what they did. It seems that they had advanced notice because they were able to create an emigration committee to coordinate movements. But nevertheless, this was a difficult time for all of these people. Many would have died because of displacement and the food shortages, as well as the disease that was ravaging the country. Pestilence and famine often seem to go together. It seems to me personally, just looking at this situation, that the Jews of Jaffa / Tel Aviv, as foreigners with few ties in the country, may have suffered more just because they had weaker connections to the countryside and they couldn't necessarily go live on their uncle's farm for a while until the fighting was over, basically. So many of them did die, and this was used very effectively in pro-Allied propaganda.
All right, let's talk a bit about Sykes-Picot and the partition of the Ottoman Empire. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement was this secret treaty drawn up by the British and the French to divide up the territory of the Ottoman Empire. That is, if they lost the war. It was drawn up in 1916 and essentially partitioned what was left of the Ottoman Empire between those two powers. But also, there were some other agreements with the Russians and the Italians and other powers about other areas of Ottoman territory. Most notably Constantinople and Western Armenia and the Dardanelles Straits would go to the Russians. But basically, the outline of this treaty is that the French were to get what's now Lebanon and Syria, while the British would get Iraq, Jordan, and most importantly to us, Palestine. What happened to Anatolia is kind of another story, and the division of Anatolia that was supposed to happen, you never saw the creation of a Pontic state or Western Armenia because in the end, Ataturk's army marched up and burned Smyrna to the ground and took over the rest of Anatolia. The treaty was secret, as I said earlier, and the only reason we know about it is today is that when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they also took all those diplomatic documents from the old Tsarist regime, and then they decided to make this public, this secret agreement to divide up Asia Minor, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. So the people who lived in these lands were not only not consulted about this, they didn't even know about it until it was actually put into effect, this massive partition. It's pretty insane. There were some other details about this, like Clemenceau eventually gave up all claims to Mosul, which meant that the British had all of Iraq now. But for the most part, the treaty resulted in, below Turkey, the borders we have today, mostly in the Middle East.
Yes, it's amazing how the treaty actually talks about areas of direct rule and indirect rule, which also bring us to pay attention to the fact that they were already considering allied families and dynasties as a source to maintain power once the war would end. But it really divided the spheres of influence that were really existent for the following at least 3 decades, and in fact for most of the existence of independent Arab states in those territories.
Yeah, and when you go to the Arabian Peninsula, those last even longer. I mean, the UAE and Oman don't leave the British orbit fully for even longer than that.
Until the 70s, yeah.
Hell, longer than that, informally. Pretty insane. But Palestine, can you tell us about Palestine's place in the Sykes-Picot Treaty?
So the thing about Palestine was that already for several decades, everybody was interested in a piece of the pie. So everybody was opening consulates. Everybody was opening, in fact, branches of their church. Keep in mind that there's a significant part of the imperialist presence over the Ottoman Empire, which was based on the existence of religious minorities. So, of course, I mean, the English kind of used, Protestant presence to say, okay, so we have some responsibility to protect local Protestants. The Russians would use Orthodox presence in Palestine to say, it is our responsibility and a right even to be there to protect the native Orthodox population of Palestine, and the French for the Catholics, and the English also for the Jews for quite a while, which is funny considering the very painful history of Jews in England and the fact that they were expelled just a few centuries before. But anyway, apparently in the 19th and early 20th century, England was the protector of the Jews. And of course, there was a big influence, and I think we talked about this in the previous episode that I was in. There was a big influence of Zionism, or kind of romantic Jewish nationalism in Anglo-Protestant Christian thought. So in the original Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine was meant to act as a sort of international area that would be jointly run by everyone.
Except for Haifa, which would be directly British.
Exactly, except for Haifa, which was key because the British had significant interests in what is now Iraqi oil, and Haifa was absolutely instrumental because there was a port already there in action to transport that oil to Europe, yeah.
Yeah, Haifa was the major port during the Ottoman era. It was not Tel Aviv, which didn't exist for...
Exactly.
Yeah, they just really loved the idea of internationalizing parts of Palestine for a very long time. Like, according to the original partition agreement, as agreed upon by the UN, Jerusalem was supposed to become an international city, essentially part of neither Israel nor Palestine.
Well, it was just an area with so much ideological, economic, political interest. And this was a time where really the Allied unity was meant to be prioritized, so it didn't make sense to fight over Palestine.
But yeah, the Clemenceau, when he gave up Mosul, he also gave up any claims to Palestine as well, which is why it never became in the international zone that was proposed to be.
Exactly, and then the Russians lost any right to claim any of these lands when the Bolsheviks got to power and they withdrew from World War I.
Did the Italians have any place in there too? Because I know they got a slice of...
They got some islands in the Mediterranean and a small piece of the Anatolian mainland, but I don't think they got any part of the Levant.
Can you imagine Italian Levantines? Anyways.
Great food, though.
Oh, absolutely. That'd be wonderful. But back to the treaty. Yeah, this basically established... This means that you will have British power in Palestine until when the mandate was supposed to expire. But that's another story.
So it's interesting. There's an interesting inflection point because by the time this came to light, which was shortly after the Russian Revolution, so we know the Bolsheviks' motivation to publish this. This was the confirmation of their thesis that World War I was, in its nature, really an imperialistic war, which was far from the best interests of the people, and even more of the people of the Third World, which were suddenly drawn to a war in which they had nothing to win. But it's really interesting to see that the relationship between the local elites and the British and the French didn't really break up once the Sykes-Picot Accords came to light. I mean, obviously it was a source of tension, it was a source of suspicion, but it wasn't a complete breakup because apparently, I mean, at that point, really all the alliances had been drawn out and Arab elites were too invested. Some of the Arab elite was too invested in supporting the British, and it was too late to regret it.
There was no turning back at that point.
Exactly. Even though it was clear that they would eventually be completely screwed.
Can you tell us a bit about the Arab Revolt, Kevin?
Sure. So as part of these agreements, the British, while they were negotiating with the French, and truly the agreement they had with the French was the one that they really upheld the most. They were also negotiating with a local Arab dynasty, the Hashemites, who had been for centuries in charge of the area of the Hejaz, which is a very important area in what is today Saudi Arabia. Now, the Hashemites had this kind of traditional claim over this land. They ruled it partly due to the fact that they descended from the Prophet Muhammad and that they had this kind of religious legitimacy over the land and over parts of the Muslim world. And they were, of course, quite irritated for several years over this policy of Turkification or this growing Turkish nationalism within the Ottoman Empire. So they could really capitalize on the growing frustration on behalf of many, many Arab subjects of the Ottoman Empire over what had been happening in the Ottoman Empire. They had been left out, marginalized, and really felt as second-class subjects. It was, of course, something that the British knew very well. So they engaged in negotiations with his family, saying, essentially believing that they were in a unique position to capitalize on the frustration of Ottoman subjects to fight the Ottoman Empire from within. This was in the form of a correspondence between Hussein, the leader of this family, who lived in Mecca, and the British representative in Cairo was named McMahon. So we know this as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence.
Say McMahon from the McMahon line.
Exactly. So over 10 letters, there's 5 from each side. We now have a register of this. The Hashemites agreed to engage in an Arab revolt, which they actually promise will be of not less than 100,000 men fighting the Ottomans with the help of the British that would send them funds and weapons. We know that it was much less, really. At some point, they would only be able to mobilize about 5,000 people. This wouldn't even be completely a regular army. A lot of these were tribal irregulars, Bedouins, who weren't very disciplined, whose contribution to the war was quite limited. But at least this was a contributing factor to weakening the Ottoman Empire from within and contributing to the Allied efforts against the Ottomans, which was seen, the Ottomans were seen partly as sort of the weaker link on that side of the war, on the side of the Central Empires. But of course, once the war finished, the Hashemites and a lot of the local allies felt that there was a bill to pay. So the British owed them part of their victory, even though their real contribution to the war could be quite disputed.
So the Sykes-Picot, again, was the real agreement here, but McMahon had made all of these terrific promises to the Hashemites, saying that they would rule a unified Arab kingdom that comprised of pretty much everything south of Anatolia. So when the bill came due and suddenly it was clear that this would not be happening, there was suddenly a lot of regret on the part of Hussein and the people who had backed him. But nevertheless, his sons, they were able to maneuver their positions in such a way that they were able to become the heads of state of Iraq and Jordan.
Yes, they didn't go completely empty-handed, even though one of them very quickly lost his position, right?
Iraq did not stay in their hands for very long. And Jordan isn't exactly the glory of Mecca.
No, that is true. In fact, the one thing that they got to this day was at the time a completely artificial, pretty much deserted piece of land inhabited mostly by Bedouins that only got really populated after the Nakba.
Absolutely, and because of the Nakba.
That's the country whose borders Winston Churchill proudly said that he drew out once when he was inebriated. But it's interesting also, if you look at the correspondence, the British are also sort of keeping their cards very close to the chest. And when they're trying to negotiate Hussein's involvement in the war, and he's really sort of gambling his life over this, because this could have been really very unlucky odds for him were he to choose the winning side. They're also saying, some parts of what you claim should be part of a great Arab kingdom aren't completely Arab. And even though this is a hard territory to draw based on the words of these letters, there's a decent assumption to be made that the British are trying to exclude Palestine, or at least part of what we know today as Palestine, from their promise to Hussein, which they also didn't ultimately keep, because they're also making deals with the Zionists, as we know from the Balfour Declaration from 1917.
Yep, that's right. But before we get to that, in the same way that the Arabs were split between the Allies and allegiance to the Ottomans, there was a similar dynamic at play within the Zionist communities of Palestine, as demonstrated by the split between the so-called Jewish Legion and an intelligence network known as Nili versus Zionists who enlisted in the Ottoman military and fought on their side against the British.
Just like Zionism actually came from different countries, and a lot of them operate as activists from different countries and lobbied different parts of Europe within the war, there was significant discussion within the Yishuv as to, which political orientation to take in World War I. In fact, they canceled the Zionist Congress one year, and they couldn't really settle on, what should be Zionism's position. And even though this wasn't a politically significant movement within Europe, the aftermath of this decision was known to be very large. You didn't know who would govern Palestine should the Ottoman Empire disappear, but you did know that if the Ottomans remained and Zionism were to choose the wrong side, then the consequences would be pretty dire for the population of Jews that remained and had to go through the entirety of the war. So we know that some Zionists like Ben Gurion, they were initially pro-Ottomans. They proposed, everybody should accept Ottoman citizenship, learn Turkish. Let's also try to dress like the Ottomans dress. Let's put on a fez, that hat that the Ottomans wore. Let's volunteer to fight in the army. But other Zionists, like Jabotinsky, that we discussed when we talked about revisionist Zionism in the Zionism episode, and also Josef Trumpeldor, who was a Zionist activist from Russia, they proposed fighting for the British. And their reasoning was that the Turks had been pretty aggressive and pretty hostile towards Zionists, whereas the British represented a new kind of hope, and it was in the best interests of Zionism to really seize on that good faith that the British had shown towards Zionism and capitalize it for the aftermath of World War I. So they proposed organizing a Jewish unit in the British Army with volunteers from the Yishuv to help them, so that once the British would win the war, they would sort of feel indebted towards Zionists. Now, the British also didn't want to give weapons and military training to foreigners, to Jews in the Yishuv who could one day rise up against them, so they only authorized the creation of the Zion Mule Corps, which was essentially a transport unit to help the British.
All they got was the Zion Mule Corps?
Yes, well, Zionist historiography will sort of glorify the Zion Mule Corps and consider it a kind of predecessor to the Israel Defense Forces. And Trumpeldor actually dies a few years later in the Battle of Tel Hai, and he becomes a Zionist idol with a statue and a very important youth movement within revisionist Zionism, Beitar, named after him. The Hebrew Youth's pact with Yosef Trumpeldor, who becomes a sort of model for what a Zionist activist should be. And there's also an espionage network, actually started by Aaron Aronson, who was this botanist, scientist, functionary of the Ottomans, who begins an espionage network to send over secrets to the British and help them identify the location and movements of Turkish troops during the war. They were also using their knowledge of languages, which was kind of necessary to move around the Yishuv in a time when Hebrew was not, the unified sort of hegemonic language all around. And obviously this tendency eventually wins, not so much because of ideological conviction or a good sense of strategy, but the Turks have been so repressive towards mostly the Russian citizens that inhabited Palestine, and the way that they took care of their population was so bad during the war that the Yishuv population just kind of gradually shifted towards a pro-British policy, which was multiplied by a lot once the British actually gave the Zionists the promise that they had been looking for since the times of Herzl.
The Balfour Declaration. I think it'd be useful to just read that out loud because it's a really, really short text. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done with which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political statuses enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That's the entire letter. That's it. It's 67 words long. As you will notice, there is no mention of Palestinians, Arabs. There is only one reference to the non-Jewish communities, but they are not named, and they're not given anything besides saying, oh, you'll have some civil rights and religious rights. Nothing but national rights.
So political rights, totally out of the question, which, flies in the face of the promises that the British had made to Hussein, but that's what you get for trusting the British, eh?
Yeah, never trusted Anglo.
I'm sure that Balfour did all of this because he was a guy with an enormous heart who just really wanted the Jews to have a land to call their own.
He must just be like a really philo-Semitic guy, right? Kevin, why don't you tell us what Balfour thought of the Jews?
In this case, I would guess it is very clear in the history of the Balfour Declaration that philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism are really two faces of the same coin, right? So
absolutely. Look at Germany. It was an easy switch to flip, honestly.
Yes. So part of the people that are involved in the Balfour Declaration had this kind of romantic, originally religious idea that it was important to bring about a Jewish national rebirth in Palestine as a part of a sort of cosmic plan that would bring about the return of Jesus and the Messianic times, the apocalypse and such, which is also quite present in current evangelical Zionist thought. But there's also this idea that, Jews are really, part of a secret cabal that runs the world. So assisting them would actually be the best way to win the war and to ensure deep American involvement over the war.
Exactly.
But you missed one particularly funny detail, that being that when Arthur Balfour was the Prime Minister of England, he pushed through Parliament the Aliens Act of 1905, which was specifically crafted to put a pause to Jewish immigration to Britain itself.
Wait, Sam. Are you saying you can be pro-Zionist and anti-Semitic at the same time?
No way.
All of that is Balfour, and Balfour is actually considered to be today as a kind of Zionist hero, this kind of just among the nations, this Goy who supported Zionism, but in reality he's a deeply problematic figure whose declaration should really be seen as the British trying to ensure the support of a local population over lands that they're hoping to rule very soon. And in fact, this is very successful. The Balfour Declaration ensured that the Shuv would lobby before the League of Nations in favor of the British mandate. They really wanted the British to be in control of Palestine because they knew that it was in their best interests and that the British would be their way to securing a Jewish state.
Yeah, yeah. So, and of course, Arthur Balfour was not acting alone. He was part of a government running, the British Empire, which at that point was the largest empire in the world. And so naturally, this involved many of the highest level people of the British government. And one of those people happened to be Lloyd George, who was the prime minister of the time, who, when writing his memoirs in the 30s, had the following to say.
Okay, so this is from Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete.
Yeah, great book, by the way. If you want to learn about the history of Mandate Palestine, I suggest you start with that one.
By the time Lloyd George wrote his memoirs towards the end of the 1930s, the common wisdom in Britain was that the country had erred in supporting the Zionists. Lloyd George wanted to convince the public that he had been right to do so. Writing 6 years after the Nazis came in power, he could have simply pointed to the persecution of the Jews in Europe as reason to have supported the Zionists, and argued that the British actions in Palestine had been a way of providing some sort of justice for the Jewish people. Instead, he explained that his support for the Zionist movement as an alliance with hugely influential political power whose goodwill was worth paying for. The war had made such an alliance inevitable. The Zionists, he claimed, had in effect forced his government to support them. It was a distinctly anti-Semitic claim. The Jewish race Lloyd George explained in his memoirs, had worldwide influence and capability, and the Jews had every intention of determining the outcome of the World War, acting, he said, in accordance with their financial interests. They could influence the United States to intensify its involvement in the war, and as real movers behind the Russian Revolution, they also controlled Russia's attitude towards Germany. The British feared that Russia would sign a separate peace with Germany, which would have enabled the Germans to direct all their forces to the Western Front. The Jews offered themselves, of course, to the highest bidder, and the British had not been expeditious in gaining their favor, the Germans would have bought them. Lloyd George believed that the friendship of the Jewish people would benefit Britain, while Jewish hostility would harm it. The British had thus no real choice. They had to make a contract with Jewry.
I'm just really loving this line of argument where on the one hand, the Jews are this all-powerful cabal that pretty much runs everything, but also they need the British Empire to guarantee Palestine to them.
It's a truly amazing... the idea of the Jews determining the outcome of the World War is one-to-one the idea that the Nazis had.
Yes, the Jews were really the force that runs the world, but offering themselves to the highest bidder. And this is a really interesting idea because this also echoes what, many years later, the Nazis would really say, which is the Jews are the real force behind Soviet communism and American presence in the world, which was a gross overestimation of Jewish power.
Absolutely. It is a fundamentally anti-Semitic view, one which Churchill kind of shared too, but that's another story.
But this is also, the success of Zionism, because ever since Herzl, Zionist aspiration was to show before world powers that they were the face of Jewry, which was not true during Herzl, and it was clearly not true in 1917 when they were a minority movement, which was growing, but still a minority. The Balfour Declaration consecrates this idea that in order to appease Jews everywhere, Zionism had to receive a very important promise, which begins a very long tradition.
Yeah, despite the fact that Zionism was not something that all Jews believed in at all.
And this is especially true in British Jewry.
Yeah, of British Jewry and Western European Jewry in general, much more assimilated, and American Jewry as well. I remember hearing a story from in my JVP group, Jewish Voice for Peace group, from this woman who was in her 70s about what her mom said when the war was happening in Palestine in 47-48, which was basically, this is terrible, nationalism is taking over our community. That was something that a lot of Jews believed. That was a bad thing. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that Jews would all come to Zionism.
Yeah, it would take until 1967 for American Jewry to completely embrace the Zionist idea. And even then, of course, there were holdouts.
The Eichmann trial also, I would argue, was a huge part of that in 1961.
Yes, the person who was found somewhere in the world and abducted in Israel.
Yeah, I guess we'll never know where they found him.
Yes, truly a mystery. Clearly not half an hour away from my house.
Please, you gonna go make a pilgrimage?
I've been there. I know the street. Garibaldi Street.
Wasn't he on a beach or something?
No, the story is much better.
What happened?
There was this German expat who was a member of the Communist Party. His name was Lothar Hermann. He was blinded because of torture from the Nazis. And he sent his daughter. They were of Jewish origin, but they weren't really, his daughter didn't even know that. They weren't active in the community. It wasn't something they talk about. And his daughter went to a German school and started dating a boy named Nicholas Eichmann. And so she told her father this, and her father was very knowledgeable about, Nazi hierarchy and politics. And he was like, oh, interesting. So what did this boy's father look like? Who does he live with? And she says, he told me he lives with his mother and his uncle, and his father died during the war. And he goes interesting. Could you go to their house and kind of tell me what his uncle looks like? And so she goes and she describes, Adolf Eichmann to her blind father. And he goes, so that's Adolf Eichmann. And he writes to a German DA. He knows this German DA to be a good guy, committed to, denazification, to pursuing Nazis, everybody who escaped, in the Rat Line, the Odessa plan. And this German DA says, I think you're onto something, but I don't really trust my country because this is still full of Nazis. I'm just going to write to Israel and see what they want to do with this. So he writes, and the information gets to the Mossad, and the Mossad is obviously very interested in capturing this Nazi. And keep in mind, 1960, Ben Gurion is very worried about some political issues. One of them was the Kastner affair, where this member of his government was accused of being a Nazi collaborator and was actually shot and killed on the street. And this was, a very difficult, kind of painful case, the Kastner affair, especially among Hungarian immigrants in Israel. So he's really trying to change his government's image. He's trying to also educate a new generation of Israelis. A lot of them are like Mizrahi Arab immigrants who don't really know much about the Holocaust. They don't feel it as part of his identity. And he knew the Holocaust had to be a central theme in Israeli nationalism. So he authorizes a special delegation to come to Argentina, which is where I am right now, as part of the 150th anniversary of the May Revolution, which was the event that really set off Argentinian independence in 1810. This is 1960, 150 years later. The delegation comes, they join the celebration, and they return to Israel with a woman that they claim is a very sick wife of an Israeli shaliach, an envoy of the Jewish agency who was working with a youth movement called Hashomer Hatzair, which I was incidentally a member of when I was young. Now, this very sick woman who was out cold, she was apparently, had lost consciousness, was actually Eichmann, who had been drugged and disguised as a woman. And it is only when they get to Israel that they say, we have Eichmann, he was in Argentina. And Argentina actually protests and says, you violated our sovereignty. You can't do this. We broke off diplomatic relations for a while. No El Al plane actually came to Argentina until 2019 when Bibi Netanyahu came here. And the Israeli government actually said, no, we didn't abduct him. This was a group of young Jewish volunteers from Argentina, and they took him and they brought him to us. So they really threw Argentinian Jewry under the bus. And also they never acknowledged the involvement of this man, this German Jewish communist who was in Argentina.
No, you can't credit a communist. Of course not.
Of course, because he was an anti-Zionist. And this man was tortured by the police because the people here knew that the information came from him. So this was the real unspoken hero, and the Mossad takes all the credit.
Awful.
Yeah, so anyway, speaking of fuckers, let's get back to the topic of the episode. The mandate system. So to begin with, Woodrow Wilson, he's often credited as being the father of a rules-based international order, or at least he started thinking in that framework. And of course, in our introduction to the Interwar Series episode, we talked about the ways in which Wilson's self-determinationist ideas had a hard limit. But nevertheless, there was influence because of Wilson. We got the League of Nations, which was sort of a first attempt at the UN, which was somehow even more ineffective. And as part of this League of Nations, there weren't supposed to be any new colonies because the reigning idea of the day was self-determination. So what happened was they created mandates instead out of territories taken from the Central Powers in Africa and in the Middle East. So rather than Palestine becoming a British colony, it was a mandate which was administered by the British until such time that the local population would learn the norms of good liberal governance, at which point they could, do their own thing and become independent. And the British are giving this great gift to the world by doing all of this.
The mandates were truly colonies with a smiley face, not just because they had this humanitarian sort of lofty aspiration in mind, but also they were allegedly supposed to have an expiration date, which was the time that, these people would have real firm institutions and a knowledge to self-govern. And also because of the fact that they would allegedly govern in the name of the League of Nations, which gave it a sort of altruistic, internationalist label to what was something that was very similar to colonial aspirations. And to add to that, the limits and the designation for each mandate power was also very closely linked to the economic agenda that these powers were already handling since before the war. In essence, the French had a strong economic interests over what is today Syria and Lebanon, so of course they got Syria and Lebanon. And the British wanted to make sure that it would have what is currently Iraq and its exit towards the Mediterranean to provide the British Empire with oil. So, of course, their mandates very closely match that aspiration.
Yeah, they get Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq.
Yeah, so naturally, the local population wasn't necessarily satisfied with this state of affairs because they saw through the mirage. They understood that this was basically the same old colonial system under a new framework, which fundamentally doesn't really, do anything for the benefit of these populations. And there was a very interesting moment in all of this when you had something called the King Crane Commission, which was basically King and Crane were Americans who had been asked by the League of Nations to travel to these areas and to find out what the population actually wanted. It was all to be for naught, as we'll see, but nevertheless, they went over to the Levant and they collected a bunch of petitions from all over this area. And some of these were written by individuals, some of these were written by entire workplaces, for example, or a village, etc. And so they got almost 2,000 of these petitions, which gives us a very good idea of what the local population actually wanted. 80% of them wanted a united Syria, so a single state, which would encompass what's now Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan.
A united Levant.
And of those, 74% wanted it to be an absolutely independent state. But 60% said that in the event that the request for full independence can't be granted, they would prefer that the Americans be in charge of administering the mandate, because at that point, the Americans, believe it or not, had a pretty good reputation in the region, as their involvement was mostly missionary work, education, things of that nature.
And that would continue forever, as we all know.
Yes, never changed. And also, Woodrow Wilson was a very good propagandist for American presence in the Third World. They would especially not want France. They wanted anything but France. And it's interesting how these kind of sort of wide aspirations for, or sort of acceptance of what could be a pan-Syrian state would later be used by Zionism to say, Palestine never existed. These people were Syrians, which neglects to acknowledge that they were actually overlapping identities and very complex networks of identification operating among the local Arab population. Yes, they were identified with a religion, with a local municipality, with the idea of Palestine, and also a greater Syrian region, which doesn't mean Palestinians didn't exist.
Yeah, no, exactly. A Palestinian friend of mine once said that, in the part of Syria, of Palestine he comes to, which is Jenin, the city they look to culturally was Damascus historically. But that doesn't mean they weren't Palestinians, and especially when Palestinian nationalism became a thing.
Yes, and they also, a lot of them deeply felt Arabs, which doesn't mean that they neglected to acknowledge that there were also cultural, national identity differences among the different Arabs. It's just that they had something in common with the Arabs in Iraq too, particularly the idea of a common language.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Professor Chaim Gerber, he had a really excellent book called Remembering and Imagining Palestine, where he goes into the history of Palestinians considering themselves to be Palestinian, which turns out Golda Meir was wrong. They had considered themselves to be a coherent people, or at least the residents who shared a common origin since basically around the 10th century, so before the Crusades.
I get most of my information about the history of Palestine from memes and photos of people with quotes on the side, and I beg to differ.
Fair point.
Do you get those the same Zionist memes in the Spanish-speaking world?
Oh yes. A lot of Golda Meir memes.
Would either of you gentlemen care to guess which percentage of the petitions submitted to the King Crane Commission supported a British mandate?
I'm going to guess sub 5%.
3.75.
That is very good. Can you disassociate that between Arabs and Jews?
These petitions were mostly written from an Arab perspective, I believe.
Who were the pro-British Arabs at that time?
Protestants.
Oh yeah, there's some of those. Edward Said's family were Protestants.
The Nashashibis too, right? One of the leading Arab families?
I believe the Nashashibis were Muslim, no?
Yes, but they were also pretty close to the British for a while. Also, parts of the Husseini family. Clearly there were elites that had, important connections with the British. And they felt, the peasant wasn't consulted for this.
Jordan as a consolation prize is so shitty, man.
Okay, I think that'll do for this week just because we've already had so much great content. So this will be part 1. Kevin, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks so much.
If people want to hear more of what you have to say, how can they do that?
If you guys read Spanish, which is the language that I mostly tweet in, you can follow me at KA_Levin, LEVIN on Twitter. I tweet a lot about stupid things, but occasionally about history and politics.
Well, that's a wrap. You guys will be hearing from us again on this topic very, very shortly. And thanks for listening to Gladio for Europe.